So we're going to go over how to create materials in a photo editor, similar to what I was talking about in the Doom 3 video. A lot of these textures were probably done in something like Photoshop. Now, of course, there's different workflows for this. So you could do modeling, take it into Substance Painter, and then baking everything out over there. But you can work in Substance Designer, and you can work in other programs like Affinity Designer as well. We're going to be using Krita, which is actually one of the worst places you can do this because it's not as robust, but it's also very fun to do it there because it's very fast. So this is an example of just one I've already done. And so it does work, and it's extremely effective and it's fun. So let's go ahead and continue on here. Let's just save that out. Do a new scene so we're ready over here later. And we're going to go to Krita. You can see how that looks after you create it. Go ahead and exit out of that. Clear all those. Let's do a new one. So anything by the power of 2 for textures works well. You don't have to be a square texture either. So in our case, we're going to do a 512 by 256, resolution 72, 16-bit for the depth here, okay? Content, 2 layers, the background color, go to HSV, set it to 50%. For whatever reason, Krita doesn't set it exactly at 50, but there you have it. So click OK and create. Now we'll have a background that's mid-gray. So we're creating a height map first. This is the same kind of way you would work in Substance Designer if you're going to create your own trim sheets or whatever. Usually you start with like a mid-gray. So that way, if you're creating a height map, you can convert that height map later on into a normal map, ambient occlusion map, curvature map, all kinds of other fun stuff, right? So paint layer 1, you're going to use lots and lots of layers basically. Now Krita has one big issue. You can't snap to other layers very well. It doesn't snap hardly at all. So under the grids and guides docker, if you don't have any of these dockers, go to grids or dockers, grids and guides. It'll pop up somewhere, just dock it somewhere. Also configure Krita. Tools, I got it in the toolbar, not a docker. Okay, so it's going to be up here. And pasting, you'll want to paste sRGB images. Okay. Now that's out of the way. Go back here. We got a new layer. We can, let's actually set up the grid. Show grid. Set it to 1. For the color, set it black. Change the alpha channel to something lower. Got it at 25 so we can barely see it. Okay. And this size here, power of 2. So if you set it to something like 64, you'll see, as long as it's linked together, this will always match our image resolution because we're using powers of 2 for the image, right? Okay, so it could be like 64, 32, 128, 256, whatever you want. In our case, this will work fine. Go back to layers. And so there's a couple different ideas here on how you can work with this. First, there's paint layers and there's vector layers. Let's just talk about vector layers real quick. So create add vector layer. That's a paint layer, vector layer, right? If we were to use like the square tool here and we change the properties for it so there's no outline and only the fill is the foreground color. So whatever we select for the foreground color, it's going to be a gray. Click and drag. We'll get a vector layer. So vector layers are very powerful. I'm not going to go over them entirely, but I just want to point out that there's like the select shape tool, but there's also the edit shape tool. When we use the edit shape tool, we click on the shape. We can actually round these corners. You can't do that with the shape tool when you're using it with paint layers. It has to be the vector layer. Okay. So keep that in mind. So with that out of the way, we're not going to be using this in this video. It'll slow us down a little bit. So I'm just trying to stay kind of fast at this. I'm going to be using new paint layers and I'm going to be using the square selection tool quite a bit. And we're just going to click and drag and do this number. I'm going to use a specific color selector docker and just set it a little bit brighter than the background. Use the fill bucket, hit F, you can fill it. All right. So this is going to be kind of rinse and repeat from here on out. We can just do this over and over and over again if we want. You can see we can drag out again, do a new paint layer, set it darker, and fill. Okay. Ooh, make sure we got our selections still and fill. So we can keep going with this idea if we want. Do another selection. Paint layer. Fill. Okay. If we want to move something like we got in the wrong spot, just hit T and use the arrow keys. You can move it precisely where you need it. If you want to duplicate, it's Shift J or Control J. I remap it so it's like Blender. I just hit Shift D and I can duplicate. So now I can click and drag and hold Shift and it'll move only up. I can put it over here. We could just do everything on one side and then mirror it later. That's fine as well. But a lot of times I do it like this anyways. You can hit enter. You can move it down, hit enter. So you get rid of the little green square. There you go. So you see where this is going now? Basically, lots and lots of layers. We can do this over and over and over again. Get all kinds of different looks and things going on in it. And to deselect things, it's usually like Shift D or something like that. I changed that to basically Control A, select all. A is just unselect all. So I changed my shortcuts for this because it just speeds me up a little bit. But you can see where this is going now. Like, it's definitely fun to get in here and work this way. It's relatively fast. You're not going to have too many major issues with it. And we can just keep going. If you want to make kind of like little tapered pieces or whatever, you could use a polygon selection tool perhaps. For whatever reason, I can't get any of my snapping stuff to work. I believe this used to snap, so it's not doing it right now. You need to have perfectly aligned edges or you'll get an aliasing effect that you probably don't want. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Just do new layers, fills. Control, you can actually sample colors. You can see we can sample that. Use the box select if we want. We can go back through and we can trim it up perhaps. Just knock off some of that crooked line perhaps. And if we want each side to be exactly the same, all we do is we duplicate it and then hit T, Control T, right click, and we can mirror horizontal or vertical. Vertical and horizontal in this case. Shift or drag it out and hold Shift. Control E will collapse the two layers or collapse the next layer. Okay. Shift E, move it, hold Shift, right click, mirror vertical, and hit enter. There you go. You see how fast this can kind of be? It's pretty interesting in my opinion. Because of this reason. So you can also do things like just, let's do half of a piece, new layer, fill it. We could use that to do a quick selection like this and just delete it. It's also a fast way of working. Shift D, move it up. For whatever reason, I can't get a hold of it. Control T, or vertical. There we go. New layer. And we just keep building these up from here, basically. And position them accordingly. This is something I used to do a lot when I was modifying video games. I do it in Photoshop usually. You can use the gradient tool. The gradient tool is a little tricky though. First, there's this button here. You can set it to a linear gradient. You can do black and white. And truthfully, like black and white's great because it's high contrast, but sometimes it's a little bit too much. So you got to get used to using this thing perhaps a little bit. We're going to do something like this. There's different ways to adjust these things. So you could go to filter, adjust, and if you just want to change the brightness, you could do hue saturation value adjustments or HSV adjustment. You just change the lightness in here now, right? So you can darken it or brighten it. That's not what we need here though. We want to reduce contrast. So we're going to go to filter and adjust levels. So you can see we can raise the dark values up or lower them, right? And, or excuse me, just raise them up. That's all you can do. Or like the bright values you can push down basically. So you can do things like this all day long. And if we look at it now, it's pretty close to what I want, but I need to go back and adjust it a little bit more. So I'm going to bring those bright values down a little bit more, just a little bit below the surface there. Something like that should work out just fine. So now I could just Shift D, duplicate, move, hold Shift, Shift D, duplicate, hold Shift. And so this is one of the downsides of using Krita, obviously. Like if you don't get these just right when you're doing this, you can see the discrepancies by 1 pixel even. So you gotta be careful with this one. All right. But once you get them all set up just right, you can control E them all back down. So you have a solid sheet. You can hit T or Control T. You want to just tweak it a little bit. You certainly can do that. All right. There we have that going now. So that's nice. Let's do another fill layer. Go up here. Let's make that a little bit smaller. Do this one pretty bright. And try to add some elements going out a little bit further. So that's one. Maybe over here. What we could do is a gradient. And we can change these colors independently. We click on the little squares basically. So this is going to be the one that starts. And let's just make this black. And we'll make the one that stops just a little bit shy of pure white. I think it's usually best to stay off pure white. Click and drag. Do a number like that. Okay. And then you already know what we're about to do. We're going to grab here. We're going to Control C, Control V. Grab it. We can hit Control T, rotate it, hold Shift while rotating, it'll snap. Let's just go place it over here. Control E, put it back together. You see how this is all combined together? So we're moving the other one. Just use the selection tool, copy it, paste it. You should have a new one on a new layer. Control C, Control V to paste it, right? And so you can do a new layer. And go ahead and start doing this out in this direction too. I want to show you a little trick here though. There's different ideas on how you could do this. You use like a circle, right? We fill that. Say, not with that, but like pure, not pure white necessarily. Maybe something a little bit less than that. All right, Control click, and then just a little bit brighter. Okay, something like that. So we can use the square selection. We can grab this shape, select half of it, move it, hold Shift while moving. We can do this number too. It's just an easy, quick way of doing this. I'm going to go from this corner to this corner, more or less, and then down. Oop, too far down. A little bit more higher there. Okay. And so now we just fill this, press F, boom. And for the most part, that should have worked just fine. We got something like that going. If you ever have a shape like this, you can duplicate it. Go to Filter, adjust HSV, turn it lower, hit T, Control T, grab a corner, start dragging it, and you should be able to hit Shift and Alt and do that. Hold Alt, you'll do just one. Okay. So we can tweak this and get it kind of positioned accordingly. It didn't quite hold up the shape the way I thought it would. Not as much as I would like it to have. So that's kind of a fail there actually on that case. There's always other options. You can Control click on a layer, select the like so. Now you can do select, shrink selection. Maybe we shrink this one by 5 pixels, right? Do a new layer, fill it, give it a darker fill. There you go. So we can also try doing things like that possibly. And this process will continue basically on new layer, new layer, new layer, right? So we can do gradients now. We can do little circles, perhaps, if we want them, like this. And every time you duplicate that, it's going to be a new layer, of course. But it's really good to do that, in my opinion. If you ever want to select something, you hold R, click on it. Usually you can get a hold of it. Sometimes you won't be able to, depending on what's going on, but we're just eyeballing all this anyway, so it's not too crazy here. We'll do a new layer, square selection through here. Control click, just make it a tiny bit brighter. And even if you can barely see it, it will show up. I promise you it will. So just keep that in mind. We can barely see that, but it's there. Okay. So we can also use the brush tool. So we can create a new layer. With the brush tool, we're going to use a soft round airbrush. Hold Shift, drag it left or right to make it smaller or bigger. And we're going to want it something a little bit smaller than what we want. So we can, once again, click this area, push it down a little. And let's say we go from this one to, they don't quite line up the way I want. We're going to click here and then click here. Oops, sorry. Hold V and then click and drag. I'm not in Photoshop. Keep forgetting. All right. Something like that, maybe. Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit too thin, maybe. Let's make it a little larger. Okay. It's pretty good. Once you've done that, you can just duplicate it. T, Control T, and you can flip horizontal. We'll get something like that. Sometimes you have like a little bit of a discrepancy between the shading here, and it'll show up. So Control E them back together. And then you just hit Shift D, Shift D, Shift D, Shift D, until it becomes solid pixels, and you Control E them back together. That's why you want to make it a little bit smaller than you think it should be. So that way it goes back together like this. Now, all right, so we've created a height map is what we've done. I want to point something out here. If we go to add filter layer, height maps, usually when they're real sharp, they don't work out too well. You're going to add a blur, Gaussian blur to it. You're going to get something like this. So you can adjust this later on. It's a non-destructive way of editing, basically. Filter layers are great. You put them at the top of the stack, basically. Also, when you're trying to create other things, like say you're trying to do a normal map, you can do a filter layer, and under edge detection, you can do height to normal map, because this is a height map after all. Boom, just like that. And you have a normal map as well, right? So we're just going to play around with the height, though, in this one. Just another side note. I'm not going to get into this too heavily in this video, because I've already talked about a little bit of this on the channel. But when we have textures, right, I'm going to go to my assets. We use Texture Ninja, for example. Yeah, let's do just something metal. And I'll drag one of these in here real quick. This colorful one. Okay, insert as a new layer. It should just take a second. It's a very large image. I'm going to shrink it. Hold shift while doing it from the corner. Of course, you'll... Oh, that's not the one we want. Let's do a different one real quick. We'll go with this one. Krita is a pretty slow photo editor. It's not that great in this respect. But you could, make use out of photos in Krita. So a little pro tip, under view, you can turn on instant preview. It speeds up the operations a little bit. Usually, if you have it's not quite doing as fast as you want. All right, so I'm just going to place this something like so for now and hit enter. All right, so if you ever do something like a multiply or an overlay, right, you can start to see how this works out. There's different blending modes, obviously. You can start to make a color map, basically, or a base color on top of this. And you were going to want to work on that for a little bit, using multiple images, manual brush work, all kinds of other fun stuff. Because you're going to want to do things like maybe, use a regular brush and start working on like a new layer on top of that. You might want to just start. Let me use my pen real quick. It's got pressure sensitivity with it at least. So you can start doing like wear and stuff on the edges, just using regular tools for the most part, or photos or whatever you want. Something we can do, right? So we'll use this as a base color. I'm just going to save it real quick just to say that, there's a lot of editing that can go into that. So we're going to save out a base color here. Call that panel 02 underscore base color. We're doing PBR type workflow for the most part, but this works better for the diffuse spec workflow, in my opinion, doing things manually like this. But let's just pretend that's our base color for now. It has like the ambient occlusion kind of burnt into it almost. And we'll get rid of that. And so if you ever want a normal map, obviously, you do normal map. One thing about this, if you take that base color or that, what's on this paint layer? I don't know what that is. What is that? Let's delete it then, since I don't know what it is. All right. If you put this below that normal map, check this out. You create the normal map, you'll have tons of information in here now. You could actually drop this quite heavily. You don't need much of that showing through, like barely even able to see it is usually best. Like barely able to see it. Something like this. So I'll save that out. We'll take a look at it in Blender in just a second. We'll just replace that. But really the height map's the name of the game here. This controls pretty much everything, right? So we do normal map. No, this is the height map. So if we make any, you want to work on the height map the most, right? Well, initially, you want to get this right before you move on to try to do anything else, because you can come back through this. You can make things metallic, not metallic. You can do metallic map, right? Or roughness map, or any of the other maps you need. And, you know, like this whole base setup here, let's do another filter layer. You'll see here, instead of using these ones, we could do like adjustments. Maybe we could use curve adjustments, or actually, I don't know where that one is right now. I don't usually work this way anymore, so it's kind of interesting. But oh, color adjustment. This should be the curve editor. So like this would allow you to tweak certain values to create your curvature map, right? However you see fit, basically. You can see it's kind of going wild right now. So that's just one way you could possibly do that, but we're not going to do it that way. We're going to do, like, there's also like edge detection, right? Also works out for curvature. But in general, like levels works good for maybe like ambient occlusion sometimes. There's all kinds of little tricks to this, right? To tweak things. You can see it looks like an AO map to me. It's pretty close. So we can tweak those values around and start generating more or less an AO map at this point. I'm going to make it a little bit darker and then balance it out. Something like that, maybe. Okay. Yeah, so you can see, you can definitely make an AO map off something like that. Just call it occlusion or ambient. Always type it out. I don't think that's what most people do anymore. But anyways, let's just make sure our height map's good. Oh, for the height map as well, sometimes you want to finish kind of like blowing out the values here. So you could go to edit levels, edit filter layer, or add filter layer, excuse me, levels. Click OK. We don't have a preview here. Right click this, click properties. That's how you get back to it. And then now you can see, like we can see our highs and our lows. We can bring in the brights just a little bit. We can bring down the darks a little bit too. So this is going to blow it out into contrast basically a little bit. So now when we do that blur, usually you do these some of these things before the Gaussian blur, something after. This one I don't think really matters. But anyways, we'll resave this, Control Shift S so we don't replace ambient occlusion, and we'll save this as panel 02 height. Okay. So now some little caveats here in Blender. We're going to delete everything real quick, create a plane. We're going to go to render preview, press Shift A, create a light, area light, just bring it up, adjust light power, turn it up a bit, bring it to the side, Shift D, duplicate it to the other side, rotate them on X. So we have a little cross section going. And we can change one to be like a light blue if we want. And we can change the other one to be more of an amber color, right? And this is so you can just see what's going on a little bit better when it comes to normal maps. You're going to look at the normal map. Now remember, this image here was 2:1 in aspect ratio. So when we go to shading here, or UV editing, our UV is squared right now. When that image comes in, this is going to stretch basically to the size of the image. So we're not going to worry about that. We'll go back and look at it in a second. But click new, got a new PBR material on it. Create vector, and we're going to need a normal map over here. We're going to need a vector displacement map later on we're going to play with right here. And then we're going to do texture, image texture. And you guess it, texture, image texture over here as well. And one last image texture up here, okay, for the base color. So first, this is going to be the normal. Go to desktop, you can see we got normal map. Plug color into there, normal into here. And we're going to make this metallic so that we can just see it a little bit better. You can see we need to stretch it out. So we're going to go into edit mode, hit tab, SX2, boom. There we go. Let me get this result going now. Okay, so you can see the normal map. We definitely have a small, especially if we crank the strength a little bit, we have a small amount of just texture in there, like high frequency texture, right? So that's good. That's nice. If we want to use a normal map, we can. Now notice if we change this to non-color, it's going to go crazy. That's because we're using an sRGB normal map. Normally it's not advisable, but I don't believe you can do it a different way in Krita. So it stays sRGB. All right. How that plays out in other software, I couldn't tell you for sure. Depends on the software. Usually I go through Substance Designer these days, so I don't have to run into this issue all that much, but that's there if you need to know it. Also, sometimes, things on this one usually look pretty good, but just keep in mind it's using linear. Sometimes using cubic actually works better on some things. So you might want to try switching that a little bit to see if it works out for you. But yeah, there you go. That's that. Okay, and so let's go ahead and add our base color. You'll see when we add this in here, this is a really dark texture. Metals are generally very bright. Well, they're usually like the quarter half of being bright on the values. This is probably closer to like halfway, even below it. So it's not quite accurate, but it gives you an idea of what it's kind of looking like. It's not too bad. So you would want to work that more properly for a base color anyways. But overall, yeah, not too bad, right? You definitely want to do a roughness map too. Matter of fact, I'd recommend going with the height or normal map and then working roughness and worrying about base color later on. It's not usually as important. Just keep in mind of your different types of materials that you're going to utilize. This is why I still recommend actually modeling things, because when you model things, you can create color ID maps and then go to Substance Painter. You don't even got to mess with like Designer or whatnot. But you can see how important the height map is then, right? Because if you model everything and then you go to Substance Painter, the height map's already done basically because you modeled this stuff, right? Anyways, so with that out of the way, we can see what's going on here anyways. No, use nodes. We're going to do color. We can do HSV adjustments. I'm just going to turn the value up a bit, see how it looks. See how it looks more like metal now when we crank that up a bit. All right, so that's just something to keep in mind, all right? Now, moving on from that, this is great and all, but usually the way we've done the height map and the normal map, if you're going to like Substance Painter, this has always been a problem with people going into Substance Painter. They use a material that has a height and a normal map, and they don't turn one of them off. Basically, you want to turn one of them off usually because they're usually identically the same things. So if you're going to use displacement, you don't need necessarily a normal map unless it's like high frequency detail only or something. But anyways, it's just one of those weird things. It's not that you don't always turn it off. Just be aware that it's might be doubled up sometimes. So you got to be careful with it. All right, now we're going to open up that height map. This is a strange one because it doesn't work with sRGB. You got to set it to non-color. And we plug color into height. Plug this into displacement. Okay. And we're going to Z solid view it real quick. Loop cut in edit mode right there. Select everything, right click, subdivide. And you're going to bump up the subdivision a little bit. Okay. To whatever you want. Now in object mode, hit Control, I don't know, 4. And we'll go with that. Set it to class or simple, not Catmull Clark, simple, so that edges don't round up. Now that we've done all that, we should be able to go Z, render preview again. Okay, see it all taking place. Press N, bring out side panel, go to options. we're using bump only on displacement, set it to displacement only, and we'll get this result. So that's pretty wild, right? It just pops out that quick like that. It's a little bit too strong. That's not realistic, obviously. And you don't want to push displacement maps too far anyways. But we can actually do this like this, which is fun. Okay. Sometimes it may still look a little bit rough. If you want, you can try adding deform smooth corrective. Okay. You don't even have to really adjust anything on this. It may correct some issues that it's having. If you still see little errors, you might want to try switching to cubic. And that might help it out as well. It softens it up a bit anyways, so it's kind of interesting. All right. So with all of that out of the way, that's kind of how you can do things with texture maps. It's something worth exploring and doing just to learn it. This way you have a better understanding when you're working on any kind of textures for the most part. Just creating things or authoring materials by hand can go a very long ways, in my opinion, as it relates to creating 3D models, because there's sometimes where you're working on a 3D model, you're thinking you're doing like high to low bakes, but it actually might just be easier to go to Substance Painter later on, and you can do this exact same thing in Substance Painter where you're creating height maps. You can actually do it in Blender as well, where you can create height maps and then turn them into normal maps. It just gets a little squirrely because the tools in Blender aren't that great for it. But there are people that do it, and there's game artists all over that utilize this kind of workflow still. And you can certainly do this on, your high poly models that are maybe you want to displace. Who knows? So you can displace them and then take them over and bake them in Substance Painter or something. So all I'm saying is there's a ton of ways of mixing and matching this stuff, right? But this is kind of the core of it for the most part. There's one thing I like to do here inside of Blender, and actually like to create it here too, which is going to be emissive textures. So you can turn on emission, set the strength to something. You see, we don't want that, so we're going to do texture, image texture, create new, emission, give it the proper name. This can be an 8-bit, it's fine. Create new image. Oh, this one, by the way, because of what we're doing, we might want to match the resolution. So if it's 512 by 256 or whatever, we might want to do that. Make it black though. Connect color to color. You'll see it comes in like that now. So we can actually Control Tab, go into Texture Paint. And up here, we're going to want to set it to single image. You can see our image is currently called Untitled. We'll just call it Emissive 2 for now. Click here and we'll do Emissive 2. Press F, we can change the size. We can actually change the color to whatever we want. Okay, so maybe depending on what we want to create, let's try doing something like right here. Probably do this with symmetry too across Y in this case. You see? And the strength up. Click, click, click. And that's kind of boring. Let's Alt E, use a line tool. E to switch the line. Just going to drag it that way. Try to line it up the best you can in this case. But yeah, you could do that as well. So this is where it gets fun because now we can change properties for it. If we want to crank it up higher, we can. Crank it down lower. You don't see any real effect here. That's because of the way Blender does things with the EV setup, the new EV setup. So like if we Control Tab back to object mode, go to our render settings here, render preview settings, go to use always for composition. We'll go to compositing, use nodes. We're going to drop in a filter glare node, drop it in right here, change it to fog glow, like the old school EV stuff. And now we can actually switch this to the 3D viewport as well. Change it to render preview, turn off the UI there anyways, if we want. So we can just tweak this real quick if we wanted to. If we wanted to get the material, we can go over here and do this as well. Change the strength. You set this to always. Okay, so now you can see the strength. This is what makes this so great, painting emissive maps here in Blender. Even if you wanted to, you could probably hit Control Tab, go back to Texture Paint. You can see, whoop, no, we're not going to have our setup here. There we go. If we right click, we still get the color picker. So now we should be using lines still, yeah. If we want to do things like that, we could. I mean, we could just add stuff everywhere, make it glow everywhere like crazy. It's really fun to do, but it's easy to overdo it. So I think right there at the bottom, that's fine. I don't know why there would be lights on a vent, but I think you get the idea, right? So make things that actually make sense too. It's useful. And maybe there's a light back here for some reason. You see? So you could do things like that. We're going to leave it alone because I think less is more sometimes. The size of this might be a little bit too much. You might want to crank the size down a bit. And the threshold, you can kind of tweak around as well. All right. And so there you have it. And that is going to be that setup there. This is how you create textures like that, materials like that for the most part. There's more, like I was saying, there's more involved with this because you could definitely spend some time creating a roughness map as well. And creating little edge wears to make some of this metallic, some of this just painted plastic, or you can really spend a minute just working all that together manually. Super fun to do it. It's something you'll want to experiment with. Learn it just to learn it. You know, don't try to work this way all the time. You definitely want to still do like high to low poly bakes and use Substance Painter. More than likely, you want to use Substance Designer when you're making things like this. And the reason Substance Designer is so good is it starts oftentimes the same way. You create a height map over there. You can even use something like Affinity Designer to create shapes to bring in as vector layers over to Substance Designer and use those there. But you create your base shapes usually, and then you can put together your trims and all that other fun stuff. But anytime you change the height map in Substance Designer, usually all the other stuff you're creating, like your base color, roughness, it's built off of that height map, right? So what ends up happening is every time you adjust your height map, like your base color might update or your roughness might update, and then all your curvatures control it and everything else, right? Or all your gradients and curves and everything, right? So it's more robust in that sense. It takes longer to set those things up. It's harder to do it all, in my opinion. It's not maybe harder necessarily, but it's just a little bit more of a tedious process, kind of filling with all the nodes and stuff. But it's more robust in the sense that like you can do it that way, right? Even modeling in like Blender, exporting at high poly and baking it back down to a plane in Substance Painter is still a better way of working because you can make smart materials over there. So this metal, you know, like, and you can bake it with the curvature and everything. And then that way you just throw a smart material on it and it's like 90% of the way there. You just have to go through and hand paint it a little bit, right? So this is definitely an older way of working. It's, you know, a little bit slower perhaps. That's why I was saying for PBR materials, it's pretty rough. But doing diffuse spec stuff, it was actually kind of fast. It wasn't too bad. But still took some time anyways. I think you get the idea. You know, you put a little bit more effort into it. You definitely can turn out some results though. Obviously, you know, when we were going through that video looking at the Doom 3 environment, most of this stuff I would say was created doing this workflow. Possibly. I don't know everything they did, but more than likely they were doing something very similar. So it's very capable, and you definitely want to, you know, just play around with it. So it's going to help you understand how everything else works, like Designer and Painter, and you'll understand more about PBR materials in general by just, you know, setting up each individual PBR material. So, you know, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I will check you out in the next one. All right. Take care.